That's the difference between Donald Trump and Greenland. Greenland can't be bought.
That's
That's
yeah,
a good one.
that's a good one. Greenland can be invaded.
Yes, by our
Thanks, Kathy.
You're welcome.
elite snowshoe forces.
Okay, so that's what this is going to be.
His government is so upset.
And Eka, I guess you can turn your video on,
Oh, I can tell my video.
just the screen, but not your audio. That way, if you're standing at the left side, you can adjust it to see on it. You can have it. Turn on and off. I should see
Okay. Bells. Spell.
I did. I did.
That just happened a minute ago.
Yeah. You noticed that, huh? Good eyes. Good eyes. Some people have maybe related to see it. You feel like, are you a detailed kind of person?
I thought it might be rude to be pointed out, but
I was like, I need to do that before the class begins. It's amazing because in the age of AI like this, and if you're a professor, when you see a wrong spelling, like you feel so happy because you can see the hand of humanity behind this, like because AI can easily fix all this.
what drives me crazy about this day and age is so much stuff that's and some, and mostly from academic PhDs and right, folks turning their doctoral thesis into a book or whatever, and some of them, so he edited as a writer. I read it. There's a book by a Oregon State professor. It's like repeated paradigms. I mean, a whole paradigm. And other places. But some people needed to be edited. That book needed to be edited. It wasn't.
I think if you have a genre or one, it's not as having. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Because everything's all about hitting the editing website.
Yeah.
It shows that
Well, this was published by the House Reps in Oregon State, and at the end, it listed a bunch of editors. So I think I mean, it was
I guess you.
Bibles.
yeah, sure, yeah. Testing.
We just needed to interview.
What to do? Right.
They memorize all in Greek problem. No. Unfortunately, I'd have to be.
Not about next weekend.
All right, I guess, can we just go ahead and start? Is it okay?
Might as well.
Because, instead of waiting. We only have, I'm thinking we kind of finish everything in 15 minutes, so we can transfer and transition to Green Center. So, okay, let me go back really quick here, to remind you of the plans for these 4 weeks. So the last week, we talk about the background and just when we talk about background, oftentimes you have to background can be all kinds of things. If you think about, for instance, if somebody asks you to describe what happened yesterday, whether you like it or not, you will see the things that happened. Describe what happened yesterday, which is my way. Things that happened yesterday is the background of the video. Right? So if you read any book on history or whatever, right? When people talk about background, they not every background is selective. Whether you like it or not, right? I ask you what happened last month or what is the background of your life, you will. So what we did last week was to describe background at number one out. But okay, the second, this week, what I want to do is to describe or to talk about the Corinthians. Alliance? Corinthian divines. What is divine? Number three, next week we're going to talk about how Paul handles this situation. And number four, week 4, which is our last week, I'm going to just go to a special case that has become a headache. Scholarship. We're in chapter 5. This translation is 6 and it comes from Greek. People don't know what the word means in this context. So we'll talk more about it in week 4. So let me review again last week, our conversation last week. First one is that the Corinthian is part of a broader exchange of letters between people. That's why people call it correspondence. There's a back and forth between Corinthians. Number 2, and I think this is very important for my conversation. Paul's relationship with the Corinthian community was complex and often turbulent. So I guess my point that I want to just reflect on this is that early Christianity is not a movement. It is like many churches today too. Early Christianity filled with conflicts and disagreements and pushback against each other. So we need to see the history of the origin of it. It gives about origin of Christianity. Some scholars think like the origin of Christianity is everybody is like so love each other, and they have like a single thing, right? That we can go back to. I think this is a mistake. Early Christianity are people dealing with conflict, disagreements, and the biggest question for us today is whose voice we want to ground our history of Christianity. And what often happens is that we have this sort of superhero syndrome. Superhero syndrome is that we oftentimes construct the history of origins of Christianity on the basis of the powerful voice is Paul. So I hope that in the next few weeks, which is maybe an impossibility, I really hope that in the next few weeks we will be able to just hear from the other side, hear from the side of the conflict, the other side of the conflict. oftentimes our understanding of the early Christianity has been the basis of theology. So a lot of books of Paul in theology. Enough book of Paul. We don't need another book. He's a superhero of Christianity. Have you read Howard Thurman's book called Jesus and this Inherited? Have you read that book? It's a fascinating story in which he actually makes a distinction between Jesus and Paul. He argues that Jesus, when somebody pushed Jesus into the ditch, nobody will come back. But if you push Jesus into the ditch, sorry, Paul into the ditch, the Roman army. And that book, he told the story of his grandmother, who actually, by the way, grew up in a mission in the slavery era. And his grandma told him, our Thurman, if I can read, I will never read Paul. Very strong statement in that book. Jesus and this inherited. Why? Because for her, the white masters, owners of slaves, often use Paul to tell slaves to obey their masters. But she has very little relationship with owners. So if you think about it, Pauls have been used by many powerful people, basically subjugate others. So my contention in the next few weeks is, can we see Paul in light of this conflict that happened? That Corinthians also pushed back against Paul, disagree with him. How Paul, if you read in the next Paul really insists that he's he said, I'm a mother. So I'm a father. He's like taking both mother and father role. You have to listen to me. You have to obey me. It's a very messy letter. In 2 Corinthians, Paul said, when I come to visit you, it was painful. And then after that, he wrote another letter. And he said, I wrote this letter with tears. But he knows that these people don't want to listen to him. I hope that we can see that in the next few weeks. Early Christianity is not like they just love each other, they just get along, and they all believe in the same thing, they all speak the same language, all vote the same. Okay? Very good. And then, unfortunately, this is what happened, is that we only hear, people scholars often say that when you read Pauline letters, it's like you're listening to phone conversation. We only hear one side of the conversation. So oftentimes scholars do what we call mirror reading. It's a technical term in scholarship. Mirror reading, what it means is that oftentimes we read what Paul says about the other, and then we construct the other on the basis of what Paul says. Right? So think about, like, if you have a conflict in your family or something, and then you ask one spouse, like, what happened with that spouse? And she is like, like this. And you as a hero would say, oh yeah, that person is. So basically, you understand of the other person is based on what that person says. So that's what happened in 1 Corinthians. Oftentimes scholars use 1 Corinthians, which is, by the way, Paul's letter to them, to describe who they are. But this goes to the problem what we call representation. Representation is not just power. But this representation means represents. There's a presence right there, and then you create a representation. Just like me and my wife, for instance, I tell you who my wife is, my description of my wife is a representation. So when you approach any representation, you have to approach it with a little bit sense of suspicion. Does that make sense? Oftentimes, and this is a little bit, oftentimes when you describe something, oftentimes it describes more who you are than who you are. If I ask you, like, what do you think America is? Oftentimes your descriptions of America will, I can tell who you are from just your description. Not America itself. You need to say your representation actually is like more who you are than that you represent, you talk about. So often, when you read Pauline letters, you have to have this in mind, right? When Paul described the Corinthians, probably he described something about him. And somehow we have to peel in between his words to see, like, we see what really happened and what is Paul trying to handle here? Why he has to say these things? We are somehow caught up in this sort of helplessness of unable to hear the voice from the other side. And this is what happened in history too many times. In American history, for instance, whose voice are you hearing? The history of the world. Whose voice are you hearing? That's why in many history departments these days, they begin to talk about the history of the history of God.
That history is written by the winners.
Yeah. If you are a winner, you tell the history. So can we recover the Corinthians' voice? I don't know. The only thing we can do is to use our imagination to think of behind Paul's letter, what's going on. It's hard because the mirror reading is like a simple logic, right? Actually using Paul. You don't have like what's in chapter 7, for instance. Now considering matters about which you wrote. So we only have the quotation from Paul. It is well for a man like a. Is this what they're saying? We don't know. This is what Paul says, what they say. Right? So we're in this sort of tricky situation in reading. All right. Given this, number 4, can we read the text with a sense of not only Paul, but also the Corinthians? Can we read with a sense of sympathy to the silenced, the marginalized, right? To those who don't have voice, to those who don't speak? So every time I read the book, like all in theology, I just shake my head. Sure, I can. It's got to be the same thing. All right.
I read one biblical writer years ago who said, he's talking about seminary professor. He said, if you were able to drop into the church of Corinth at that time, what do you think you would find?
Yeah.
That the professor said, I have no idea what you'd find. I can almost 100% guarantee you'd be surprised.
You'd be surprised to see what happened there. Yeah, I agree. And what oftentimes happens is that we think we know what happens there because we base everything on the video. And what happens is, if you read, this is what I feel like often happens in schools. Or become the hero in which this is happening. So the typical description is that this is a chaotic community. They just hate each other. They just divided, fight, and so on and so on. And Paul is the hero. Really to You need to be united. So Paul becomes like the hero of the story, protagonist of the story. Good guy. And one scholar even says, we will know what the Corinthians get wrong. So the perspective that is often used in scholarship is that in many books in First Corinthians, that the Corinthians are messy.
Kind of this special city in Greece. I mean, it's just part of the Aegean Sea and the other side of it, 6 miles across.
Yeah, it's called Maritmus.
Yeah, goods and stuff across. This new thing. A lot of slaves all over the river. It's constant. So that church of constant.
Exactly. That's why there's a lot of dynamic in this community. And Paul feels like there's too much going on here. We need to straighten this church back again. It's just like this quality as a center of commerce. There's a number of idols. Temple of Dionysus. A lot of like different sort of cultural expressions in Hawaii. Right? Because just like many, if you think about many cities, big cities, that near big water. London, near big water. What else? Almost every European cities are near the Florence is needed. Why? Because the flow of goods and services went through what? Through the water. Traveling. So Corinth has 2 ports actually. One port connects the western part, and then the other port connects the eastern part of there's that small gap called Isthmus. There's a road called Diolkos. Actually, some scholars argue that probably you can pull sheep from one side instead of going around them. You can actually pull sheep from one side. It's called Diolkos. But anyhow, so you can imagine, this is a very dynamic city. A lot of beliefs, a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas. Right? When you have a city that filled with many people, it's not just different colors like this. Different colors often represent different experiences, different thoughts, different ideas. That's why I'm really annoyed when I see people who think about diversity only. You go deeper into that, they get irritated. You need to think like us. Picture of the website, right? There's a terminology scholars use these days. It's called racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is that we use as a way of gaining political, social, and economic value. Racial capitalism is everywhere. In college, educated colleges. Now you have pushback with AI, So this next 4 years is going to be messy, I tell you. Next 4 years is going to be messy. Anyhow, let's talk about the structure of First Corinthians. Okay, to understand the general structure of First Corinthians, we need to consider several factors. First, you need to know that Paul, when he wrote this letter, letter means it's a geographical distance that separates him from the community. Implication is this: because he's not there, he actually has to rely on sources. This is not a world where you have Zoom and then Skype. We don't have Skype anymore. We don't have Yeah, before Zoom, everybody used Skype. I remember when my wife was, because I came to the US first, we turned on the Skype 24 hours. It's like a window, I can see her like easily. You don't have that. People say that the travel from Pompeii to Rome can take it's only 150 miles per hour these days. If you drive, 150 miles, 80 miles per hour, or 70. How many of 100 drive 80 miles per hour? Less than 3 hours, probably. If you had the story, I just think the story. We had the story of somebody who's actually so an hour. He's in an accident. He died, right? Doing to why are you not protected? What do you think? You're running faster than the angel. So back then there's no Skype and other things. That's why he had to rely on knowledge sources. This is extremely important. You read this. Paul probably had a knowledge of the Corinthians when he was there. Things have changed. And he had to rely on second information to write this. All right. Therefore, on the basis of this, 1 Corinthians can be structured as follows. So if you have your 1 Corinthians chapter 1 through chapter 6, it's mainly based on a report from the Stephen. So if you have the background, 1:11. For it has been reported to me by close people that there are quarrels among you. Quarrels among you. So chapter 1 through chapter 6, he was like, on dealing with this report. Our quarrels among you. Can we describe this as an oral source? Probably. There's one scholar argued that this is an oral source. The second part of 1 Corinthians is based on a response, is actually it's based on a letter that he received from the Corinthians, chapter 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So you can easily divide 1 Corinthians into these two parts. The first part deals with the report from Paul's people, which actually covers 1 to 6. And the second part is based on the letter that he received from the Corinthians. By the way, as I mentioned before, we not have. And what's interesting is that in chapter 7 through chapter 16, we find this expression. In Greek, it's called peride. Often it's translated as now concerning. Now concerning. So you can see it in chapter 1, 7 verse 1. Chapter 7 verse 1. Now concerning the matters by which. If you go to chapter 7 verse 1, 5. Now concerning virgins. Changing the topic. Now concerning this, now concerning this. This expression is actually the second one. Let's see 8:1. Now concerning food sacrificed to animals. 12:1. Now concerning spiritual gifts. Can you see that? Now concerning. And then 16:1. Now concerning elections for the saints. And then 16:12. Now concerning our brothers. So this expression is the second part of 1 Corinthians. So can we describe this distinction between first part and second part? Can we describe it as the distinction between moral source? Right? The first one is news and report he received from Jewish people. And the second part is the letter that he received. The problem with this view that it is moral process, we don't know whether Jewish people it could be written. So this is in the book, I say that it's okay maybe to describe as moral and written, but it's not really 100% certain. But I think we can describe it as indirect source. Indirect source meaning to say that he hears from something else, whereas indirect source he weapon from them. It's not oral versus written. It's actually direct sources. So big picture wise, you can actually divide First Corinthians into the opening section and then straight into chapter 7. He switched to another source, direct source, and then so this is the bigger picture of First. Now, let's go to chapter 1, verse 10. I'm going to read this story. Let's read this together. Let me read, and then you can follow in your Bible. We actually use the same. Glorified Standard Version. Yeah. Okay. I want to read this, and I just want you to think with me, like, what? If you read these things, what do you think is happening? Now I appeal to you, he said, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind, the same purpose. It has been reported to me by close people. Models among you, brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apostle, Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ. Ask this question: has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Christ, so that no one can say that you were baptized in me. So after he's like, I baptized none of you except for what? Well, no, I forget. Here's the thing, I forget. It's like, I did baptize also the 1,000 of the house of the Jews. This is not right. Interesting how he. I did baptize also the house of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I got Christ did not send me to be baptized, but not with all eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ may not be. Quick popcorns. When you read this, what do you think is happening?
Four different groups are arguing.
4 different groups are arguing each other.
By the way, Cephas,
Yeah. Yeah. What else? What do you think when you read this?
well, Paul's is trying to establish his authority to mediate all of these arguments.
Yeah.
By humble brag.
Humble brag, okay.
I mean, it's all has these statements. All writing this. I didn't have to. It's not happening. But listen to me. What I said.
How to professor in business hearing Paul more than anybody else. persecute the church more than anyone. Mr. Stanley said that Paul was a pastor. And he uses the term, he's a stand-up. Think about it, if you talk to somebody and that person loves to exaggerate things. So that's Paul for him. Yeah, it seems like there's the vision for sure. For probably. The other thoughts on you see this? You read this? I think so. What about the straight to do?
Who are Chloe's people?
Well, close people. That's a big question. Who are close people? The expression is interesting. Close people. Like, if you read close is the close people. People's of close. Yeah. Exactly.
Everybody.
So some scholars have suspected that close people are probably slaves. Because if they are just close children, they would use the father's name. Right? So probably, and the expression of the thing, or the belonging of Paul, of clothes. We can translate it, right? The belonging of possession of clothes. Because genitive has like off in English, it is off.
She possibly be a teacher though, who has her own certain.
Has,
There's obviously some of that was.
oh, for sure. For sure. For sure. But what you see here is that Paul seems to hear this and Paul gets annoyed, right? Paul was so unhappy when he heard this news. Most people probably there's all kinds of speculation. We don't know. So most of speculation is just on the basis of Greek.
It's interesting that we use that sort of genitive of the belonging to Chloe. We've also got these. I belong to Apollos. I belong to a lot of.
Yeah, it's actually the same expression. You're right. Yeah. Look at
There's one a pass and the other one's a skull.
Look at the translation, right? How people translation is a fascinating field of study in itself. Because when I was in Malaysia, I did a lot of translation. The translation is people who speak in English. There's no such thing as exact pronunciation of the language. But especially Greek. I've taught Greek for many, many years, I tell you. Americans have a hard time learning new language. Why? Because for Americans, it's so easy to travel around the world using English. There's no need for you to learn other languages. That's why I'm only saying that, many people don't have that privilege. Right? But yeah. So what really happened? This is the question, right? A reading of 1 Corinthians 1-4 might suggest that the church in Corinth or the community in Corinth, the word region, and translated in assembly. This is, by the way, a political term. Church. And somehow in American, in English, the church has been so spiritualized. Asia is political community. Suggests that the church in Corinth was deeply divided and its members engaged in intense struggle. This is probably the impression you can have, which is not far from what has been speculated in scholarship. Many scholars have argued that this letter specifically addressed the issue of divisions that has arisen within the newly established community. This is messy, divided community which Paul helped straighten them, asked them to be united. Right? John Kloppenberg from the University of Toronto asserts that factionalism is a clear problem at Corinth. It's common community, common fellowship. And when you read the book on 1 Corinthians, you will be very likely encounter this. So Corinthians are a divided community. They just hate each other. Fight. They don't like each other. Paul comes and say that united unit. That's the common reading in 1 Corinthians. However, Neil Dow is a Norwegian scholar, for many years in the he argues something different that I actually based my entire reading of 1 Corinthians, the book that I wrote, based on his research. So he argues that the root of the problem in Corinthians is not necessarily factionalism per se, but rather the Corinthians' rejection of Paul's authority. So there are many different sort of factions or groups in Corinth. The problem is not the division itself. The problem with Paul is really upset about it. It's because these people don't want to look into the go on. This is what Dahl said. And we can see why I think Dahl has a strong point here. Dahl argues that these chapters are probably, quote unquote, an apology for Paul. It's not about division, it's about Paul. Meaning that Paul's main concern is to defend his apostolic authority against opposition within. Think about, I like the English word for it. His grip, he lost his grip. He was incredible. Control. I'm going to strong with the influence in everything. Soft one. He feels like he needs to do something about it. So, Dahl argued that Paul is not battling Judaizers or engaging in doctrinal dispute. For Dahl, this is not a doctrinal dispute. But rather, he's trying to reassert his authority over a community that seems to be questioning it. This is why it gets messy here. Paul's concern with this rejection of his authority is emphasized clearly if you read 1 Corinthians 9, verse 3. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 3, Paul says something like, this is my apologia. This is my defense. Right? To those who would examine me. So they were like, remember last week we talked about Apollos came. He was like highly educated. And what? Man of, remember that last week? Words. And people in Corinth are like, no, we don't want to listen to Paul anymore. This is more attractive person to listen. Paul says something like in chapter 9, this is my defense. Yeah.
Preceding verse 9.
Yeah.
Meaning, Paul's rank on everybody else by saying, have I not seen?
Which is I have a lot of opinions about it because there's no evidence that he actually has seen Jesus. He burned. Is he making stuff up here? Probably. Yeah, but it's not. It's a spiritual encounter. It's not.
Who puts that in this?
But we don't know. He actually doesn't. By the way, in the story in Acts chapter 9, he actually doesn't say a word about it. Just only this. Why not see? Oh, but you need to understand. If some people come to Corinthians and say, like, hey, don't listen to that guy. He has not seen Jesus. He's just like some guy. Yes, it's good that you have to listen to him. Listen to us. We met Jesus ourselves. Right? And Paul said, have I not seen Christ or Lord, the Lord? You can see the tension in there. So Dawes argue, this is Dawes' argument. Paul's concern is actually not the vision thing. Paul's concern is merely these people have questioned him. So 1 Corinthians is actually an apologetic. It's an effort to defend his authority. It's an effort to say that don't listen to other people, listen to me. Goodness, that I don't know if you have met any church leaders like this. There are many of them around, by the way. But things like a community has to be centered around a pastor or a church or certain church leaders. And that's what we see in 1 Corinthians. It's a messy letter. That's why I say it's a messy letter. At one point I told you last week that Paul actually threatened them that I want to come to you with a stick. In week 4, we will say that Paul actually used even more violent language. Chapter 5. Even far more. So I want you to see this, like this dynamic, that this letter is based on the context. Okay. So in a nutshell, what happened is a Corinthians rejection of Paul. By the way, Paul is a leader who is no longer there with them. His presence is no longer there. They say, don't listen to him. He's no longer here. There are many people here. There are Paul's and other people who can listen to him. And then 1 Corinthians is basically a Paul's force. So, what? When we closely examine the slogans, if you see, go back again to 1 Corinthians 1. When you closely examine the scholars mentioned in 1 Corinthians 11, it becomes clear if you read it that Paul is not particularly interested in elaborating on the details of different things like this. There's a division among you. I'm a Paul, I'm a what? Stephens, I'm a Apollos, right? Once he said it, he move on. He doesn't elaborate what's going on here. Did you see that? He moves on. He's like, has Christ been divided? He continues on. So it seems like, when you read it, it seems like his concern is not that division. Why? Because right after he moved on to the next part of the letter, after briefly stating that he has heard about the visions, he quickly sees the work himself.
Kind of buries his own name. That's an Easter egg in that phrase. You're all divided. So follow Paul.
Yeah, exactly. And then he continues on and he talks about himself. So probably, I think Dal has point. The concern is not the vision itself. The concern is actually, because of that division, they have nothing. Right? So notice that the first question concerns Christ, right? If you see, I belong to Christ, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Stephens, Christ, and then he continues. Yes, Christ. Right? Next, as Paul I mean, think about it. If this is really a division, Paul is like, yeah, the Apollos, he's going to comment, Apollos believe in this and this. He probably would just, he's right, he just throw it there and then he move on. This suggests that Paul's main concern is not division per se, but his unease with the rejection of his theology. As Dow points out, this is what Dow says: the slogan "I belong to Christ" is not necessarily a motto of a distinct Christ. Echo of F.C. Bauer's article in 1970, Christ Party. But this is not necessarily a motto of a distinct Christ Party, but could simply mean this. This is what I said. I belong to Christ, therefore, independent. Can you see the difference here? So the same logic could apply to the slogans I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, reflecting the Corinthians' reluctance to give Paul Saul. This is a